Vocational Rehabilitation: Challenges, Changes, and Insights. The big picture. Before the 1900s, public rehabilitation did not exist. People with disabilities were considered wretched, dreadful, and pathetic individuals who were unable to benefit society except to serve as taunted objects of entertainment in circuses and exhibitions. Those who were disabled either died before old age due to improper medical treatment, or sent to insane asylums and institutions, or they hid in their homes, vanishing from public life. Many underwent forced sterilization, preventing them from ever reproducing. Question: do you know what prompted the federal government to grant public assistance and rehabilitation to disabled veterans during World War I? Between 1910 and 1920, attitudes regarding those with disabilities began to change when thousands of veterans with disabilities of World War I could no longer work or perform their jobs, resulting in financial hardships. This lack of employment prompted veterans and policymakers to begin challenging the government for change, and won. Veterans then began receiving federal assistance and training in exchange for their service to the nation, but it only included those who were relieved of their duties due to illness or those wounded in battle. As time went on, those who were unable to perform any manual labor and World War I veterans past the age of 62 were also included. Question: do you know during the 1920s who also became eligible to receive federal disability services? During the 1920s, the Civilian Rehabilitation Act allowed federal funding to individual states on a 50-50 match basis to help develop federal but state-run rehabilitation programs to provide training, placement services, job-related adjustment, and prosthetics. Also, benefits became available to all Americans with disabilities, thus establishing the beginning of the Public Vocational Rehabilitation Program, or VR. Question: do you know who were allowed to open vending stands in the lobbies of federal buildings? During the 1930s, World War II brought about many more wounded soldiers in need of rehabilitation, but veterans of this war meeting the requirements found greater independence with new advancements in technology, as well as receiving government assistance. Now, this was great if the requirements were met, but those experiencing conditions such as seizures or psychological problems were excluded and forced to rely on church groups, organizations, or strangers for help, or were forced to live out the rest of their lives in institutions. During the 1930s, benefits also became available for the elderly and blind and disabled children. The Randolph-Shepard Act made it possible for blind vendors to become employed at vending stands in the lobbies of federal buildings, helping to show the country that those with disabilities are able to be productive. Question: do you know what was established to emphasize the capabilities of those with disabilities? During the 1940s, those with mental illness and mental retardation began receiving equal rehabilitation opportunities. Also, physical restoration services became available, including cataract removal and limb reconstruction. Hearing aids, wheelchairs, and other supportive devices also became available through VR to help people with disabilities find and keep employment. States were now required to submit a written plan to the federal government, and publicity campaigns emphasizing that people with disabilities are competent to work were enforced, prompting the National Employee Handicap Week to be established. This helped change society's stereotypical view of what workers with disabilities were capable of. Even though advancements towards independence had been made by those with disabilities, gaining access to public transportation, telephones, bathrooms, and stores was still lacking. buildings with stairs were forbidden zones, and negative attitudes from employers continued to make getting hired difficult. Question: do you know, during the 1950s, what was established for disability and rehabilitation research? During the 1950s, the VR program grew dramatically. Scientific research into disabilities and rehabilitation was funded by the federal government, establishing the National Institute on Disability and Rehabilitation Research, or NIDR. Federal and state aid now offered disability benefits to include the permanently and totally disabled, and provided more program grant matches and funding for professional VR training. Question: do you know what was the reason behind the crippling of the VR program? During the 1960s, the civil rights movement brought about more changes when those with disabilities joined forces alongside other minority groups who were demanding equal opportunity, treatment, and access. With the new changes and more people with disabilities becoming employed, the government relishes the fact that money could be had through taxes. To keep the money coming in, VR now permits services to those with social conditions, such as drug addiction, alcoholism, and discharged prisoners, and others with non-medical conditions, causing a surge of VR offices to start up in prisons, welfare offices, and other public places. This quickly taxed the system, as now processing claims were not properly evaluated, training options were reduced, and those with the most severe disabilities who required top priority were not getting the proper assistance and at times went without needed services. Question: do you know, during the 1970s, what helped those with disabilities carry out their vocational rehabilitation plan? During the 1970s, the Rehabilitation Act was formed, prohibiting discrimination on the basis of physical or mental disability. VR programs were now required to serve only those with severe disabilities, thereby permitting a close working relationship between the counselor and the client. A formal individualized written rehabilitation program was created to help those with disabilities construct and carry through with the requirements. As disability advocates expanded, those living in institutions were now placed in new residential facilities and group homes, in hopes of encouraging those with disabilities to become more involved in the community and gain self-sufficiency. Accessibility standards were also placed on all federal buildings, and public transportation was made available. During this time, the addition of Supplemental Social Security Insurance, SSI, was created to provide funds to families raising children with disabilities. Also, amendments made to the Higher Education Act of 1972 made suitable public education available with fewer restrictions, enabling individuals with disabilities to receive secondary education. Question: do you know, what did the Rehabilitation Engineering Service provide? During the 1980s, the Employment Opportunity for Disabled Americans Act made it possible for those receiving SSI or SSDI to keep their medical benefits even after gaining employment. Rehabilitation engineering services were supported and upheld, providing guidance, recommendations, and customized assistive devices for individuals in need. Question: do you know, what benefits remain intact to those with disabilities even after they found work? During the 1990s, the Americans with Disabilities Act, the ADA, provided more disability accommodations for the workplace, such as restructuring job sites or modifying work equipment. Due to this new legislation, those with disabilities were now fully included to participate in all levels of society. With the advancement in personal computers, all staff members could now participate in statewide networking, making it possible to reach those far away with disabilities. And shortly thereafter, individuals with disabilities gained access through their own personal computers with the help of VR. Question: do you know, what is the goal of the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, WIOA? Since the year 2000, education for those with disabilities has expanded to allow those with disabilities to go to post-secondary education, vocational training, and employment. Business leadership networks support businesses who hire qualified individuals with disabilities. The Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, WIOA, continues to remain focused through support and innovation for individual and economic growth. The goal is to increase opportunities, especially for those with barriers keeping them from employment, and recognizing the importance of having a tight bond between education and career.